Cryptocurrencies have been fundamentally transforming the startup and investment scenes over the last couple of years around the world. In this talk, we will discuss what has been happening around us in that regard and also where are we going from here. Our guest is an avid investor in early-stage startups. He has served on the advisory board of many already successful ICO projects, and he is also an internationally acclaimed award-winning author. Please welcome Ali Madavji. So hello, Ali. Thank you very much for being here and welcome to the Online Crypto Summit.
Thank you so much for having me, Victoria.
Yeah, sure. So okay, can you talk a bit about your background and how are you currently involved in the industry?
Absolutely. So I've actually been in the space for a while as an investor, and then I started my first blockchain venture in 2017, at the start of 2017, called Global DCX, which is an exchange that's currently betaing in the Indian market. And then we're also looking at several other countries to expand to. So I launched that exchange, helped to grow the team, raise significant capital to help basically get it off the ground. And then I basically moved over to focusing on my private capital fund, which is called the Blockchain Founders Fund, as well as an advisory business where I've got many staff that help me across kind of all walks of an ICO, essentially helping, not only with like white paper review, but looking at marketing aspects, PR aspects, helping to look at how do we get presence on online forums and help share, who our clients are with the rest of the community, helping to run their bounty programs, helping them to get listed on exchanges or ICO listing sites. And so essentially kind of a more comprehensive package, as well as helping them to bring in advisors and help to form their team, provide management advice. As from my background, previously I'd advised a number of different startups in the traditional sense. And so kind of bringing that business experience here as well to help grow our clients. So been involved in many different ways in the industry and continuing strong with strong belief in the future of the industry.
That's great. So talking about the industry, I noticed that a lot of people use the term blockchain and cryptocurrency interchangeably. Can you speak a bit about that and help us make that difference and distinction?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the blockchain is the underlying technology that's fueling that's fueling essentially the innovation around this, right? And so the way I look at it is essentially kind of like it's almost like the internet itself. It would be kind of the distinction, right? And then you've got a number of businesses that are kind of built on top of that, right? And so some of those businesses would have fundraised a lot of capital and can grow off of the backs of, say, that underlying protocol, let's call it. And so the funding that comes in from the cryptocurrency side, that's essentially a way to help to fuel those businesses and provide them, say, the cash needed to, say, pay staff or, invest in building up the technology required with machinery or, designers and marketers and, everything else that you need to run a business. And so the big distinction that we see is essentially the underlying technology versus kind of the fundraising component, as well as some of the cryptocurrencies actually have very good use cases where they not only are a fundraising mechanism, but the cryptocurrency itself is ingrained into the mechanism of how the business is actually structured. And so that would be the way that we see the distinction. The blockchain side is in reality the real big innovation. So looking at things like distributed ledgers and the ability to record that but not manipulate it, right? And so this is a very useful thing in a lot of different industries if we're thinking about, like, say, supply chain or other things. So that's the way we look essentially at the two. We do think that the cryptocurrency side has has of course grown very quickly and has probably been the part that's brought in a lot of the interest into the technology, just because the sheer amount of funding has not only created incredible returns for investors, but also it's created an ability to bring in talent into this industry like never seen before, right? So when when a coin or a cryptocurrency raises significant capital and can then fund to bring in, say, industry leaders from tech and from media and journalism, and bring those people onto their teams and kind of bring people over from the traditional industries over to, say, blockchain or cryptocurrency. That has been, I'd say, also a very big innovation that has not always been factored in though.
Hmm. So since you've been involved in the industry from its early stages, can you share how did you see it change over time, and can you share your thoughts on where it is headed from here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the interesting part I think about blockchain and cryptocurrency is that there wasn't much interest in the earlier days, right? And not too many people knew about it. The people that knew about it were I would say super users, very interested, but not necessarily from a return perspective. And so that has kind of evolved pretty significantly, I would say, with people believing in the underlying technology and almost just believing in it without the intention, say, of profitability, and not sure where it's going to go, to now an industry where there is massive interest. You've got funds coming in from all over the world, including Wall Street, and coming in from the UK and coming in across Europe and Asia. You've got governments giving particular interest and scrutiny to the industry because of good things and bad things that are happening. And then you've got consumer interest that's also particularly interesting. And so you've now got more people than ever, for example, joining, and we've seen some of the numbers of for example, new users on Binance or on different exchanges, which have ranged all the way into the hundreds of thousands per day, right? And so you've got this massive interest that's come in over the last, I'd say, year. And it's slowed down a little bit right now because of the market correction, but we see that as kind of a temporary cyclical thing that we've seen a number of times before. So we've seen corrections, many times. We've seen extended ones, we've seen shorter ones. But as long as you believe in the underlying technology, and then you believe in where some of these projects could be going and what the impact they could have, I think the industry is very positive and will bounce back. However, saying that, we think that from our perspective, with what we do with our fund, as well as the projects that we get involved in, we do see a lot of things that we don't think will survive. And so we like just being very conscious of the industry and the future potential of it. There's also going to be a lot of things that they don't survive, similar to maybe how we saw the dot-com bubble, right? And so we're very aware of a lot of these businesses not being, say, organized with appropriate governance or strong teams or things like that that'll help actually run a successful business in the long run.
Yeah. So can you share your thoughts on how the startup scene transformed with the rise of initial coin offerings over the last couple of years? Maybe start with what the initial coin offerings are and how are they different than what we currently have seen.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, an initial coin offering is essentially a way to tokenize a project, and so you can essentially say create a set number of coins, and you can create some sort of token economics for how that's structured into that project. So ideally, it's not just for fundraising, but there are projects that use it purely, I would say, for fundraising. But generally, with the better projects, they're actually built into and ingrained into the project in a way that only allows them to operate with tokens and incentivizes appropriately the use of those tokens. And so this essentially creates almost like an alternate currency within that platform. And so assuming that that business is successful, those tokens would be demanded from a use case perspective. So the users of those technologies or those companies, but then also investors would be interested at times, at many times, to basically buy those with the assumption that the business itself will have a lot of demand for those tokens, and therefore the token values will go up. And so individuals would be interested in, or investors would be interested in those tokens. And then those would also get listed on exchanges, which would provide liquidity for these businesses. What's really interesting, being also a traditional angel investor in businesses, is the ability to liquidate your assets in a much quicker way if you need it. And so typically when you invest in, say, startups through private capital, things like that, you might need to wait a few years to liquidate an investment. And what's interesting from the cryptocurrency side, using an ICO, is you would be able to have that listed on exchange and consider liquidating a portion of that to, say, cover your costs for operating some of your businesses or whatever you might need those funds for. So I think that is a very big innovation, is the ability to liquidate an investment rather quickly, or at least having the ability to. The other very interesting thing that comes out from an ICO is essentially the ability for small startups to not only, so typically what a small startup would do, or any company, if they were raising traditional capital, is they would say go to 10 venture capitalists or 100 venture capitalists, right? Maybe it's a combination of venture capitalists, angel investors, and other types of family and friends, etc. And so what's interesting here is now you're not only going to those 100, but you're essentially going to the world's investors. And that now increases the number of potential investors significantly. And so what happens is we're seeing basically an increase in valuations on these projects, because you're not only going to, say, a small subset of investors. And so that's been one of the things that people have talked about in a different way, but have said, hey, cryptocurrencies or ICOs have these inflated values. But it's not necessarily just because of the hype in the industry, but it's because you're actually expanding the number of potential investors, which increases demand for investment in those projects, which essentially increases funding to those projects. And so, I mean, touching on that as well, I mean, from an ICO perspective, that's not always a bad thing. So at times, I mean, having too much cash at an early stage company can be a bad thing, and it can lead to waste and get the team to not focus on what they really need to deliver. But the flip side of that is it actually gives them substantial capital to grow the business and scale it much quicker. And so there is a very positive angle to this, and allows them to hire the talent that they need, from industries, from maybe industry competitors, and bring essentially the best of the best into the cryptocurrency or blockchain space. And so that's been one of the really good things from the ICO perspective. Was there anything else that you wanted me to touch on in terms of ICOs? I think you mentioned.
Yeah, maybe will this trend of continue? Yeah, in 2018 and beyond.
Absolutely. So the way we look at it is we essentially see three phases with the ICO industry. So the initial phase was very early days. So just post the Ethereum ICO, you could essentially raise pretty significant capital with maybe a white paper, right? So you have a white paper, pretty much it. You don't need a very strong team. You don't need necessarily a very strong idea. There was a lot of capital and very few projects to invest in. And so that made those very few projects kind of very attractive, even if they necessarily weren't in a traditional capital sense. Then the second phase that we saw was essentially having a strong white paper and a bit stronger of a team, maybe getting better marketing, actually showing a vision of where this is really going to go in a more comprehensive way, making sure that you're increasing communication to the community a little bit better using different channels like Telegram or other social media channels like Reddit, Quora, Bitcoin Talk, Twitter, etc. And so we saw that as the second phase, where then the original just having a white paper didn't cut it anymore, and you needed to step up essentially what you were doing. And the third phase, which I think we're starting to enter into, but we're still kind of at that moving point between the second, or transition phase between the second and third phase. But the third phase is essentially where we see having world-class teams. So when any startup out of Silicon Valley that is very strong, or out of the major hubs of the world, like in New York or the UK or Singapore, Hong Kong, or Shenzhen and Shanghai and Beijing, when these companies and the best companies in the world, the best startups in the world say, hey, we would rather not fundraise from the 20 or 50 investors around us, but we would rather fundraise from the entire world's investors and have them, get interest in our project, and we would want to benefit from the marketing and having the community see what we're doing, because that'll drive interest in our project, and maybe it'll drive sales in our projects. And so once that starts to happen, which it's starting to, that's where we see the real big innovation. That's what we really see succeeding, right? So these world-class teams, the best in the world. So traditional, VCs will essentially start getting diminished, and we'll need to continue to move more and more into the cryptocurrency space, because that's where all the best projects are going. That's where we see one of the real big innovations. And so with that, we see, more competition on the ICO space, right? So we're seeing the best teams in the world that'll succeed on the ICO space. That's where we see this trend going. We see highly credible projects that have real use cases for the blockchain. So I mentioned a little bit, but the blockchain is great for things that, are involved in, say, certain types of record keeping that involve eliminating counterfeit or fraud. So if we think about like supply chain and, fake purses or fake wine or things like that, where you can actually now track in a way that you cannot counterfeit anymore. Those are great use cases. Or, we've got a project that we're advising called the Open Source University, and they're working on eliminating fake degrees and transcripts. This is the type of thing that can essentially change dramatically countries that have this type of problem, where there are a lot of fake degrees and transcripts. And there's other components to that project, but this specifically is a great use case for the blockchain. There's another project that we're working on called the Decentralized News Network. And what's really interesting about them is they're essentially looking at eliminating censorship and fake news. And this, again, is a great use case for the blockchain, because it would not otherwise be possible to do this in an effective way off the blockchain. And so we think projects like that have a much higher likelihood to succeed, especially if the market corrects even more significantly, and as the market demands projects that have real blockchain use cases. We think those are the types of projects that are going to succeed, that really leverage the underlying blockchain technology, in addition to benefiting from that fundraising component and benefiting from building that global community of investors, but also users of these projects.
So what should we expect to see from projects that raised already capital over the last couple of years, and what to expect from them in the coming year?
Yeah, so I mean, from our take, in the coming year, so we think in the coming year to 2 years, there will be a potential bigger correction, where some of these projects that say don't have proper governance, right? I mean, you see projects that have all of their funds, all of their company assets in one wallet, right? So, not proper governance, or they don't have, say, a segregation of duties between banking rights, right? You don't see them having, a CFO that helps them to control their funds or to diversify risk in that way. They don't have a board that can help minimize risk and decentralize some of the decision making. They're not tapping into their communities and getting advice and really leveraging the power of the community to, say, build new partnerships and things like that. we think projects like that that have taken, say, significant funding, but maybe have gotten distracted, we see those projects as continuing to decline and potentially maybe not even exist in 2 years' time, but we don't know. We see projects that are keeping close relationships with their communities, and you see groups that are making introductions for their projects. People that might just own masternodes or own a 1 ether even worth of a token, and they're going and emailing the company saying, hey, I've got a relationship, a partnership that I think you'd benefit from, or hey, I've got an introduction for you that I think could lead to more success in this project. And companies and management teams that see that and leverage that and essentially bring that into their company and strengthen their companies and run it like a proper business, that have that proper governance set up, understand how to onboard talent and retain talent, and motivate employees internally. Those are the types of businesses that we think are going to succeed. And there is no, in our opinion, slack that should be given to an ICO or a cryptocurrency based company versus a traditional company. They need to run this as a professional business. They need to communicate to the market. They need to provide in the future financial statements showing, how is this company actually doing? Like, are they moving in the right direction? Whether that's even if they're at an ability to monetize yet, but even if they're not, providing like, these are the new risks we're seeing in the industry. These are, the opportunities that we're seeing. This is how we're tackling them. This is where management's worried, right? These are the things that are keeping management up at night. Like, these are things that are traditionally done, in a 10K, like in the US, in financial statements that, you'll see in an MD&A and things as well. So this is the direction that the industry is moving and needs to move. And there shouldn't even be any slack given to a cryptocurrency based company. And so this is going to be also difficult for some of these companies to professionalize and really undertake and thrive under.
Well, as the ICO world opens up to investment, not only to venture capitalists and institutional investors, but to the regular people as well. And would you talk a bit about that, and what should people be aware of when deciding to put their money into such a project? And let's say for people who are not who have not invested before, what should be an amount of money that it's good to start with, to play with?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I mean, so one, I'm not an investment advisor.
This is not an investment advice.
Of course. No, of course. But I think what people need to do is be very cautious, right? So there is a lot of hype in this industry traditionally, right? I mean, right now the market is low, it's a little quiet, but there traditionally has been a lot of hype in this industry, and there are clearly bubble aspects, right? And so that doesn't necessarily mean the entire industry and every single company within it is a bubble. And I think there are still, diamonds in the rough that you can find. And I think there are still worthwhile projects that will succeed, but being very conscious that there are bubble aspects and, you could lose everything, right? Which, like, your entire investment, which is, I would say, generally very different from if you're making equity-based investments and you had, say, a diversified portfolio. You wouldn't expect, even in a recession, for most or all of those companies to go bankrupt. In the ICO space, that very well could be the case, with a very large percentage going under or not being credible. I mean, some of the things that we look for as a fund that invests in projects and invests in teams and spends time to grow credible projects, and we've got a very rigorous process that we use, that includes everything from, very strict due diligence, and we're doing sorts of background checks on individuals related to those teams and advisors related to those teams, and looking even at bank statements at times, looking at a lot of the blockchain addresses and contributions and things like that, and actually tying things out and making sure that really things make sense from what management's telling us and what's actually there. So given that we do all that, what things that we look for is having a very, very credible team, right? and that includes founders that not only have a vision, but that are product focused. They need to be execution focused to actually make this succeed, right? So we don't want them to be, say, these cryptocurrency experts that are, say, pumping their coins or talking a lot about their coin. We want them to be talking about the underlying technology and what they're actually delivering and innovations that they're bringing. And so that's one key thing that we're looking for on that front. The second front that we're looking for is projects that have a really good blockchain use case. I mentioned some of that related to, helping to eliminate counterfeit and fraud, and maybe that leverages the record keeping and the benefits of that from a blockchain perspective. We think that that's in general a much better investment than say something that's just using it purely from a fundraising perspective. We also think that protocol investments can be interesting. So these might not be, say, as profitable in the short run because they're developing essentially that internet layer that we talked about. But we think that if they get it right, and if we believe that they have the ability and the vision to really execute on that, building something like the next internet will have, of course, massive returns, but also you're part of a project that has a major influence on transforming maybe the world as we see it today. And so we think that protocol investments are also quite interesting. In addition to that, we do look at projects that have good governance and that are also coachable and open to advice, because one of the things that we want to do, and we know that not all teams have it, right? So some ICOs might be first-time entrepreneurs. Some might have had successful ventures, but they didn't run everything on their own. And so being coachable and being open to us saying, hey, you need to diversify your risk by splitting things into different wallets, and you need to diversify risk by making sure that your CFO can't just access this on his own and access all the funds and move it, but we need to figure out a multi-sig solution, maybe that includes biometrics or other things where you can no longer just have one person access the funds, but you need to have multiple people that access the funds, right? So being open to those types of things, or being open to saying, we need to bring on additional advisors from the industry perspective that can provide us advice, and we need to make sure that they're open to actually understanding the direction of some of the top people in the world in their industry. So that would be like, for example, if it's a cryptocurrency based on supply chain, the supply chain side they need to be very open to, because that in reality is the real business, right? And so they need to really execute and nail that side of the entire equation very, very well. The other side of it is the cryptocurrency side, which we do want to bring on strong advisors, and we also want them to be coachable and willing to understand some of the aspects of that. So that's some of the things that we're looking for in projects, and it's not always easy to find as a general investor. So some of the things that you can do is, join their Telegram group, see what people are saying, go on Reddit, Bitcoin Talk, Quora, go on GitHub, see if they're actually doing any code. If they're not actually doing any code, I mean, that's already a red flag. I don't think that that's necessarily that's a kind of a be all end all, but it's a good indication on what are they actually doing related to the project, right? So that's another good way. Also, of course, looking at things like ICO Bench or ICO tracking sites that can give you some sort of ratings on the project and can see how other people have analyzed it. So not only the pure rating, but going through and analyzing some of the comments in there from experts around the world and saying, they're saying that, this has a strong team, but maybe there's certain components that, are riskier. And so understanding that. One of the other things that I didn't mention about the trend in the industry, but also interesting from an ICO perspective, is we also do believe part of this industry will move more closely towards actual securities. And so I was on the advisory board of Polymath, right, which is essentially an investment bank on the blockchain looking to securitize assets, following all local regulations and adding them onto the blockchain. And so this is actually a very interesting development as well. And you're seeing pressures from the SEC and other regulators in moving in this direction where, accredited investors would be able to invest but that may cut out kind of the individual investor from those earlier stage investments. And so being conscious of that, where they may not always be able to access ICOs as they move more and more towards only looking for accredited investors for the ICO. And so that's kind of a trend that's starting to develop based on pressures from different regulators, but not all regulators agree. And so you're seeing still a lot of potential ICO opportunities in other countries, but not in some. And so that's another development to be aware of. And I guess one other thing that we've seen with smaller projects is that over-promising. So when you see things that seem too good to be true, like we'll guarantee you a 20% return annually, or things like that, those are the types of things that we think raise red flags, as well as that over-promising of projects.
Yeah. So also when looking at a project, how important it is to evaluate the token use within the project, and what makes a good use of a token in an ICO project. Can you talk a bit about that?
Absolutely. And so we talked a little bit about the requirement for a strong blockchain use case.
Yeah.
And those projects typically have the tokens ingrained into the ecosystem in a much better way, where there would be massive demand from a traditional user base. So for example, the open source university that we talked about, they'll have students, they'll have employers, they'll have institutions that would request degrees and transcripts, right? And so there's demand essentially for these tokens from those companies. One thing that is good is ideally they don't even know it's always running on the blockchain. And so it should be simple enough, for example, for an employer, if they want to buy a transcript, they should be able to still buy a transcript of a student with, say, a credit card, right? And in the background, it can essentially be buying tokens based on the purchase from the credit card. And it can be buying tokens, for example, off of the open market, and then burning a portion and then transferring a portion to the higher ed institution that should get some of the funds, given that the transcript would be coming from those institutions. And then also in the way we've built it is some of the actually even goes to the student to actually incentivize them to actually adopt and use and promote this platform. And so, looking at something like that example, you can see that there's a real use case for the tokens, but the underlying technology of eliminating fraud and counterfeit related degrees and transcripts is leveraging that blockchain use. And so we think something like that is very interesting and very positive for the market. Then there's also, of course, the side where investors can buy this from, say, like the open market, but that's based on their perceptions and their beliefs in that actual business being successful, right? And so this essentially is much better than a lot of the speculative assets, or the speculative I guess assets that you see right now in the cryptocurrency side, where people are just saying, we're only going to buy it because it's going to go up. And there's not really a proper use case for a lot of these tokens. And so just being aware of that and understanding those token economics, understanding the structure, understanding, whether or not then some of those tokens are going to get burned by the company, which then, will decrease supply and theoretically increase price, understanding those components, understanding if the project is going to be paying out parts of their profit to token holders. In reality, I mean, although that sounds good, that's actually the definition of a security. And so we've seen already certain crackdowns starting on those types of projects. And so while you might think that that sounds really good, if they're not registered appropriately as a security, we're starting to see potential risk with those if they start getting approached and start getting subpoenas, et cetera, from regulators. And so those ones actually might have a negative aspect, but understanding those dynamics and how it really works is important, because at the end of the day, we do see potential big corrections, and we see projects that don't have those strong use cases declining, but projects that do have those strong use cases will see a consolidation of investment and talent and belief in those projects. And so those ones will really, really be successful. But being skeptical of the market as a whole is always important, and making those any sorts of investments or contributions in a calculated and careful manner.
I see. So, going back to the crypto market, and it's interesting for me that Bitcoin is currently amounting for a bit over 50% of the total industry. So what this implies, and do you think this will diversify in the future?
Yeah, so I mean, that is a good question that, you know, I think it is still to be told, right? So if we go back, you know, to the Ethereum ICO or just after that, right? We had a Bitcoin dominance of above 90%, right? And so this was, it was essentially Bitcoin was cryptocurrency. That was pretty much the definition, right? Given that anyone that you talk to that, you know, had invested in blockchain or was thinking of investing in blockchain, all they knew about was Bitcoin. Then the Ethereum ICO started to gain traction. Then we started seeing the ICO innovation, which was one of the big innovations that came out of the Ethereum platform. And what ended up happening is more and more interest in a lot of these other projects, and a lot of hype on them, a lot of good projects, also a lot of bad projects attracted money. But you saw this growth in these ICOs, and a lot of people saw the investment opportunity. A lot of people saw the technological revolution that could also come out of some of these projects. And you saw Bitcoin drop down to, you know, 37, 38% dominance. And then now with the recent market correction has gone back closer to 50. And, you know, we do see that potential strong projects that are not on Bitcoin will succeed. We do see protocols that are different to Bitcoin will succeed. We do believe highly in network effects. So we think that platforms that already have a lot of users have a higher likelihood to succeed. And to beat a project that has already a lot of adoption, let's say like Ethereum or like Bitcoin, is very difficult. You can't just be incrementally better than those platforms, because that won't cut it. They're going to need to be 5 times better or 10 times better from a technology perspective to actually build the user adoption and the acceleration to actually overtake those types of platforms. And we see this all the time with traditional businesses, right? I mean, if you look at, you know, any sorts of technology out there, you probably have seen small startups or other companies that do it better than those, but they don't always get the adoption. Actually, it's rarely they get the adoption versus the incumbent player. And so just keeping that in mind. And so we do see that, and we are actually personally, I'm very bullish on Bitcoin itself. I think there is a big value of having this as essentially a currency that say is a bit of a store of value. Right now, I think it's still very volatile, but I think it's growing into a store of value. I think it does have a lot of gold 2.0 aspects, and I think a lot of people, including myself, believe that it is a gold 2.0 and turning into that in the future. It's still highly volatile though, whereas gold doesn't have that volatility in the same way. But also what's interesting about Bitcoin is certain innovations that are coming out. So things like the Lightning Network, which people aren't aware of, but essentially very, very low cost transactions and almost instant. I mean, this is, you know, why a lot of people are liking some of the other top 20 coins that are payment based. But once Bitcoin, and if Bitcoin does release this, which has been beta, it's been tested pretty rigorously. Once this gets released, you know, that is a major innovation in Bitcoin that could essentially take market share from a lot of those other top 20 payment coins, which are smaller. So when you think about network effects, you would rather use Bitcoin than those other top 20 if the payment speed and cost was just as low or lower, right? Another thing that is expected to come out on Bitcoin is actually privacy. And this one is a little bit controversial because there's one benefit of the blockchain is going to be that transparency. But the other side is actually privacy. And so depending on which side of that coin you're on, you might be excited by privacy. But I think that this is actually a big innovation that'll come out on Bitcoin in the next year or so, that'll actually help to potentially increase the price of it, but it'll increase the value of it, not necessarily always of the coin, but of the value proposition of Bitcoin itself. And so that's also quite interesting to look out for, because that's essentially what, let's say Monero is promoting, right? It's that privacy coin. And so will Monero still have as strong of a niche if Bitcoin essentially adopts privacy? And so these are kind of interesting questions that are going on. I mean, one thing obviously to be aware of is Bitcoin traditionally has been a little bit disorganized and a little bit slow with innovation, right? And which is why a lot of these other ICOs and a lot of these other tokens coming out are increasing their lead in certain aspects on Bitcoin. I don't think they would replace it from that gold 2.0 or that psychological aspect, but from a technological aspect, there are plenty of things that are much more efficient and effective than Bitcoin. And so we do think that those will continue to succeed. So, I mean, from your question whether or not Bitcoin will maintain 50% or not, we don't know. We think it could decrease in terms of dominance, but we think that the value proposition of Bitcoin will significantly increase. And so we're bullish on Bitcoin, but we're also bullish on a lot of the underlying technologies that are coming out from the protocol perspective, but also things like dApps that have very good use cases for the blockchain. And so we're very excited about those as well.
So there are quite few coins on the race to mass adoption, besides Bitcoin, of course. So which are interesting for you to watch out?
Yeah, I mean, we tend to get involved with a number of different projects from an investment perspective, as well as from an advisory perspective, the things that we think are particularly interesting. But of course, I'm going to share some of the projects that we're excited about, but we are involved in them. So just to be aware that, we do have a vested interest in these projects, but we are very excited and aligned in the future success of these projects. So, as I mentioned a little bit, there's the decentralized news network, which is, really looking to transform news as we see it. And this can actually, in our opinion, if we get it right, can really transform societies that can now access, real news that's brought in a more objective way to the market. And so this is the type of thing that, will combat oppressive governments. It'll combat fake news, for example, that we're seeing, come out around the world. And so this is something that's very interesting. When we look at something like Rexseal, they're essentially looking at being an escrow platform to help reduce landlord and tenant disputes from a rental market. And they can do this not only in real estate, but also in other types of rental pieces like equipment. And so we think that this is also a very good company. They've got a strong team there that I think has a lot of potential. We've got a project called Loyak, which is really credible team looking essentially at helping to manage sensitive information for companies. So for example, when companies are doing an RFP and how that information can be shared and coordinated and collaborated with. And so that's a very interesting project. We've got something called Cryptic, which is essentially, I would say, almost like a Google Drive or Dropbox 2.0, which is not only has incredibly low latency rates, right? So if you look at like Filecoin or Siacoin, which are cryptocurrencies, they're quite slow in terms of actually being able to use because the way that they've decentralized it and because of the way that they've built the underlying technology, they're actually quite slow from a latency perspective. But what Cryptic and this team is incredible, what they've been able to do is have very low latency rates, so very quick response rates, where you can now use it for things like collaboration potentially in the future, backups and other things, not only from a consumer perspective, but also from an enterprise perspective. But not only can they do that, it's also more secure because it's decentralized across a lot of different servers. And so this is actually a very big innovation because not only is it kind of like a Google Drive 2.0, but the security layer on this is beyond what we see on these types of products. And so this essentially helps to reduce the cost significantly for businesses or for consumers from a security and a cloud storage perspective, which basically delivers more value at a lower price with higher security, right? And so this is a very impressive innovation. We've also got some exciting things coming in the pipeline. So we've got a company called Discovery IoT. They're basically a supply chain play, but they're looking at major innovations on essentially bringing down the cost of chips, like IoT-based chips that can track goods. And so what's interesting here is right now, IoT, so the Internet of Things based chips like RFID or NFC chips, they're actually reasonably expensive. And so you can't use them on low cost products, which is the everyday products that you and I are actually using. But the innovation that they're working on, and this is two extremely credible founders, they're essentially looking at bringing down that cost base because of their backgrounds in essentially product development. And what that's going to do is open up a massive market for, maybe putting these chips on a can of Coke. And so now you can track essentially any product out there if they get this right. And that is going to be one of the biggest innovations, not from a crypto perspective, but from a supply chain and IoT based perspective. And so this is actually very, very exciting for us. And so we see projects like that. I mean, there's things like that have very, very big impacts on what they're doing. And that's what excites us, is not only looking at this from, an investment perspective, but we're looking at these on, projects that actually transform their industries and actually put blockchain, really into the mainstream, but ideally in a way that users don't know it's blockchain, right? So if you think about, the internet or different chips, you don't talk about, using wireless LAN chips. You just talk about using Wi-Fi, right? And you don't actually even know, most people don't know the underlying, pieces within that, or you don't talk about TCP/IP, right? And so very similarly, we want to bring blockchain to the forefront, but we don't necessarily want the entire world knowing that this is running on blockchain. It should be a very smooth user experience with, world-class user design that's brought into these innovations. That's really going to fuel mass adoption, in our opinion.
All right. Well, thank you, Ali, very much for this insightful and very useful conversation. Would you like to add anything else before we close?
Absolutely. So, I mean, just off of this, one, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. But two, definitely, if you're interested in investing in ICOs, do follow, more videos like this, watch things on YouTube, do your due diligence, right? Check out GitHub, Reddit, Quora, Bitcoin Talk, like we talked about. Make sure that you understand the risks of these types of investments, and that it is something that you are able to potentially lose all of, and be comfortable with that, because it is something that we're starting to see more of a trend of, where people are losing more than they can afford to, especially with this recent market correction. So being very conscious of that, making sure that your mental health is strong, that you're staying healthy. Like, these are important things that we're seeing more and more of as people say take out a mortgage and invest it in crypto, which are not things that we recommend, but we've seen this type of thing happening more. And so just making sure that you're very conscious of this. Exactly. And so be cautious, but look at this also as a learning opportunity, and to be part of a revolution of an industry that will have major impacts across various industries and sectors over the next decade or 2 decades and going forward. And so it's very exciting times. It is still early stages, in our opinion, and so do get involved, but cautiously, and continue to learn more about this exciting revolution.